Hi, my name's Greg, and I'm the writer and co-creator behind the Chronicles of Aeres, an unofficial new high fantasy setting compatible with D&D 5th edition. What you're watching is a behind-the-scenes featurette about where Aeres came from, what it means to us, and why I think you, as a player or a dungeon master, will enjoy it. It started in the 80s with maybe the nerdiest kid you've ever met. I was a kid completely and utterly obsessed with fantasy. I devoured fantasy books like The Hobbit and the Dragonlance Chronicles, which I loved, and games like Final Fantasy and Zelda. What you see here are all my original copies. I also adored fantasy movies like Excalibur, The Neverending Story, The Dark Crystal, and I still do. And as you can tell, I still watch these movies because I only have the DVDs and Blu-rays. Obviously, I don't have my VHS tapes anymore. For years, all this media consumed my waking life. Fast forward to high school. It's 1998, and I meet my best friend, Frank Mills. One day he turns to me and he says, "Hey, have you ever played Dungeons and Dragons?" I'm like, "No, I've heard of it. What's that like?" And he says something like, "Oh, it's a game where you play a character in like Middle-earth." I had to think about it for a second, and then I knew it was over for me from that point on. We played AD&D 2nd edition almost every single day for years. We played it before school, at lunch, after school. We even played it on the bus. We became completely obsessed with it. Somehow I ended up being the dungeon master, which I was okay with because I always loved to write and create my own stuff. We eventually switched to 3rd edition, but we didn't play it for very long. I sat at my Windows 98 computer for hours and hours listening to Led Zeppelin and Blind Guardian over and over again, working on a huge, painstakingly detailed world for AD&D. I was infatuated with Tolkien, especially the Silmarillion, and I wanted to make a world just like that and take Frank and my other players on adventures within it. So Aeres, which I called the Land of Forests, came from that bedroom in high school. Of course, the whole setting came from the mind of a high schooler, so probably the writing doesn't hold up. There are huge exposition dumps, lots of names that don't make sense, characters who were mentioned once and never again, stuff like that. But the foundation was laid for what we're working on today, and a lot of it has survived the ravages of time. Imagine that it's over 18 years later. We're all in COVID lockdown, and my friends and I are talking about what we can do about it. For some reason, we all have the itch to play D&D. It's been a really long time. We haven't played in at least 15 years, so that's what we do. We all bought 5th edition books, and I started cracking on a new campaign set in Aeres, the same setting from high school, with a lot of the same characters and themes, but a ton of new additions. Small bits of lore became fully fleshed out. We redrew the world map, we bought new miniatures, and I wrote a huge, extensive new story with a ton of modern twists. We played all summer long this year, and it helped develop the world of Aeres more than ever before. It was a ton of fun, and all of a sudden we had this thought. We've had such a good time with this setting almost our whole lives. Why aren't we sharing this with the D&D community? So, I had to sit back and think about the setting and what it means. Aeres is almost a time capsule. It's from a different era of D&D. I knew from the beginning that the project had to have a ton of retro throwback elements. I wanted the cover art, for example, to look like an 80s fantasy movie poster. So I started writing, looking for talented artists, and hammering out what made Aeres stand out and what it needed to be as a setting. My mind started to drift to all the fantasy media that I grew up with. Most of it I've already showed you, and how those books and movies influenced our game all these years. Immediately I thought of The Secret of NIMH, one of my favorite movies of all time. I thought it would be pretty cool to play as a character like Justin or even Martin the Warrior from Redwall in a D&D world. Sure, I mean, there are a few kind of animal fantasy settings out there for 5th edition like Humblewood, but there was really nothing out there in terms of D&D settings that let you play as a character directly inspired by the Secret of Nim and have them living in a fantasy world alongside elves and dwarves. And I thought about The Dark Crystal too, a huge influence on my youth, one of the best fantasy movies of all time. Everyone loves the Skeksis. They're dripping with malicious personality, and they're so cool. But there aren't really any D&D settings where you can encounter characters like that. I guess you could try to translate the world of the Dark Crystal into a homebrew game, but it's so weird and esoteric it probably would be really tough to execute. I realized that's part of where Aeres gets its strength as a setting. It's not a kitchen sink. I'm not throwing in absolutely everything from fantasy that can fit in the world. Instead, the Chronicles of Aeres helps you recapture those nostalgic, powerful moments and iconic characters from the golden age of fantasy. It's self-contained and thematically cohesive, but you can bring in monsters, traps, and tropes from all over the D&D universe and make them fit within the setting. We know it works because we've played it ourselves. I've been working on this for a few months, and as artwork for the book started to pour in, we realized how easy it was to take some of the ancient stuff we created for our high school campaign 20 years ago and reimagine it for a modern handbook. Aeres is super old school. It's about humble heroes, epic quests, and realm-threatening villains. It's not just Dragonlance and Tolkien, but folklore and mythology. This kind of almost naive, classical fantasy is becoming a little bit endangered, and we want to keep it alive. Part of what makes Aeres so exciting for us is the fact that it's a fairy tale, storybook fantasy world, but one that's been unwillingly thrust into the trappings of Dungeons & Dragons. We have classical fantasy monsters and characters. You can play as a witch or an alchemist, for example, fully fleshed out and inspired by folklore. You can explore enchanted forests, a verdant wilderness brimming with magic and mystery, marble-spired cities stretching to the sky, or dark and perilous caverns littered with treasure. We tip our hat to the old-school Renaissance for helping keep the fire going, but our setting is built for 5th edition because we want as many people to enjoy it as possible. Thanks for sticking with me until the end. We're really working hard to bring the Chronicles of Aeres to life, so please check out our Kickstarter landing page. I'll put the link in the description below. And be on the lookout for our free preview on Drive-Thru RPG. We look forward to hearing how Aeres re-sparked your imagination.